Well, welcome back to In the Word. We are going to start a short series here, just looking at some various views of the millennium. Now, as you know, the millennium is that period of time where Christ will reign on the earth. 1,000-year reign is my view of, I'm a premillennialist, which means I think Jesus comes back at the beginning of the millennium, that he reigns for 1,000 years on the earth, and then his kingdom is handed over to the Father at the end of the 1,000 years after a final rebellion. Not everybody holds this view, so we're going to be looking at some other views and evaluating them, looking at them a little bit more closely. So let me start with just an overview of millennialism or end times. Like this Theophilus of Antioch, I think, had a pertinent comment: give reverential attention to the prophetic scriptures, and they will make your way plainer for escaping the eternal punishments and obtaining the eternal prizes of God. So prophetic scriptures are sometimes neglected. People will sometimes avoid them in church because of concerns about divisiveness. Not everyone agrees, but certainly the early church was clear that we needed to be talking about prophetic literature, prophetic scriptures, as well as if you look into the New Testament, 2 Peter 3, for example, emphasizes the need to have a clear view of the end times. So we're going to endeavor to do that. Now, just because we don't all agree on the end times, we shouldn't be running off and accusing people of heresy. I think we're all reading the Bible. We're all trying to understand it as best we can. Over the course of church history, there's basically four standards for what we would call an orthodox or an acceptable view of the end times. That's what the eschatology is. It's about the end times. So those four things are the physical return of Jesus to the earth, Jesus's or the bodily resurrection of believers and unbelievers alike, a final judgment, and a literal heaven and hell. We can have divergence of views concerning the end times within the bounds of what we would call historic orthodoxy in the church. So it's important that we not belittle or demonize those with different views, but rather respectfully engage those views and try to understand the different views and sharpen ourselves as to why, by understanding why they feel a particular, why they understand one view over another. Again, this millennial view basically is answering the question, when does Jesus return relative to the 1,000-year kingdom? When does he return? There's three views essentially that we're going to cover in this short series. We're first going to look at the amillennial view, discuss that at the beginning, discuss that in a moment. Then we'll look at the post-millennial view, and then the premillennial view, which is what I hold to. So we'll look at all three of these over a period of several short videos. I'll try to do them in bite-sized pieces, but we're going to begin, as I said, with amillennialism. So, amillennialism, there's some key assumptions they make about the book of Revelation. So let me just examine that. And as I try to do, I like to let the amillennialist speak for themselves. Now, the amillennialist generally, and we'll get into this in more detail later, but their view is that the millennium began at Jesus' first coming, and it ends at his second coming. So in other words, we are living in the millennium now. The millennium is not a literal 1,000 years, but it's a long period of time. So the alpha privative, the at the beginning of millennial, means that they deny a literal millennium. It's an unfortunate sort of label, but it is the popular label, and we should use that. So let's take a look at Anthony Hoekema, who has since gone be with the Lord, but let's see what he had to say as a representative of those who take the amillennial view. It begins with some assumptions, some what we could call presuppositions. Let's assume, for example, he says, that the book of Revelation is to be interpreted in an exclusively futuristic sense, referring only to events that are to happen around or at the time of Christ's second coming. Let us further assume, says Hoekema, that what is presented in Revelation 20 must necessarily follow, in chronological order, what was described in chapter 19. We are then virtually compelled to believe that the 1,000-year reign depicted in Revelation 20, verse 4, must come after the return of Christ described in Revelation 19, verse 11. So we're going to come back to this, but we're going to use this as a starting point in evaluating amillennialism. And we're going to begin by examining the assumptions that he has laid out here, really assumptions that the amillennialists deny or dismiss. So the first one we'll look at is, does the book of Revelation present itself as exclusively futuristic? Well, the book of Revelation doesn't leave us in any kind of doubt as to what it is. It says at the beginning of the book in chapter 1, verse 3, and at the very end of the book, chapter 22, verse 7, that this is a book of prophecy. Prophecy. Some would say it's an apocalyptic book. And by apocalyptic, they'd take liberty in interpreting some of the more symbolic areas of the book. But the book itself describes itself as a prophecy. And I like what Paige Patterson has to say here. The best conclusion for understanding the nature of Revelation of John is to see it as a prophetic circular letter, which not infrequently makes use of apocalyptic imagery and device. So in other words, it's a prophetic letter sent to churches, circulated among 7 churches specifically, that uses apocalyptic kinds of language. So, what is prophecy? Let's just break this down a little bit. So you understood as 2 aspects, both forthtelling and foretelling. You've probably heard this before. Forthtelling is divinely inspired revelation that's relevant to the reader's current circumstances. That is, the original reader's current circumstances. So it meant something to them when prophecy is forthtelling. There's always also an aspect of prophecy that is foretelling. That is divinely inspired revelation that have to do with future events, things that God is telling us is going to happen in the future. Sometimes those are great promises of blessing. Other times they are promises or warnings of potential disaster and punishment. And it's easy to see that the book of Revelation contains both. It contains both forthtelling and foretelling. For example, at the very beginning of the book, in verse 19, there is a text that seems to lay out a outline for the book that contains both forthtelling, telling John to talk about things he had seen and things which are, that's the forthtelling. And then later in that same verse, he's telling John to talk about things which will take place after these. That is, he's talking about foretelling. So he's telling John that he's going to talk about things that are current and things that are future. So we see that the book of Revelation is not exclusively futuristic, as Dr. Hoekma would assume or dismiss as an assumption. It has elements that relate to current times and from the perspective of the reader in verses 1 through 3. And then elements that foretell the future in chapters 4 through the end of the book. So it's got both in there. People make mistakes. I think our Amillennial friends make some mistakes as when they try to make the whole book either foretelling, or sometimes dispensationalists make mistakes when we make the whole book foretelling. It actually has both in there, both foretelling and forthtelling. So the first assumption that it's exclusively futuristic, we can dismiss that. It is not. So let's move to the second assumptions that amillennialists dismiss, is that does the book present itself chronologically? Of course, our amillennial friend dismisses that, says there's three, and I think there's three reasons to view it as chronological. You have this repetition of this important phrase in the book, metatautau in Greek, or after this in English translations. There's an apparent outline of the book that suggests a chronological progression in chapter 1, verse 18 of the book, so the book itself. And then finally, the last round of judgment, the 7 bowls, are said to finish, complete, or be the last plagues, which all point to a chronological progress through the book. So let's take a look at these one at a time. Here's the time marker. Meta, if you look at the standard Greek lexicon for the Bible, BDAG it's called, it's identifies meta as a marker of time. Excuse me, got a little bit of a cold. After another point of time. So in other words, sometimes you see this after this, translated after this, or simply then, then, then. And you see this throughout the book of Revelation. I've mentioned here as the chapters 1 to 22, and I've indicated where in the book of Revelation we see this Greek term, metatautau, or what we could say, and then. It's, again, a chronological marker indicating that we have some chronology, some chronological progress through the book. It's what we're seeing here. So metatautau is one evidence that we have a chronological progression. Another thing we have that indicates a chronological progression is found in the book itself. Again, we're looking at just evidence within the book. It says that, therefore, in verse 19 of chapter 1, write the things which you have seen. So this is the Lord speaking to John. And the things which are, and the things which will take place after these things. There's metatautau there, after these things. The apparently, this outline is a chronological outline, talking about the things which John has seen in chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, the letter to the churches that were existent at the time that this letter was dictated to John and sent to the churches, those things which are, from the point of view of the reader, and then the original reader, and then the rest of the book, the things which will take place. So we see, again, this chronological progression, both by the outline of the book itself and the presence of this phrase, metatautau, that we already looked at. Last thing we'll look at is evidence of a chronological progression is the identification or the description of the judgments. So famously in the book of Revelation, there's 3 cycles of 7 judgments. The seal, the trumpet, and the bowl judgments. Some would say take those trumpets and bowls and move them all to the left and say they're just repeating themselves. That's what the amillennialists would say, and we'll look at that later. But they would say that there's a repetition here, not a chronological sequence. But the book itself indicates that there is a chronological sequence. In chapter 15, verse 1, it refers to the bowl judgment at the end as the last judgment, which are the last, it says. It says in chapter 16, verse 17, that the bowl judgments are with the bowl judgments, the wrath of God is done. Again, indicating that these are the final ones in a sequence. And finally, in chapter 21, verse 9, these are the 7 last plagues. And again, indicating that there's a sequence of plagues. There's more than one plague here, not just recapitulation of the same ones, but these are the last 7 of the last plagues. So again, we see from the phrase metatautau, we see from the outline of the book, and we see from the description of the plagues or the description of the judgments that there's evidence here for a chronological sequence, and it's evidence that we've taken from the book itself, right? So let's make be careful about that. This is evidence that we've gotten from out of the book itself. So we've examined whether it presents itself as chronological, and there's ample exegetical support. Now, exegetical, kind of a fancy word for some of you, just means that it's support that's in the Bible itself, that you could go to the Bible and look at it itself. So there seems to be support for this. So let's go back and look at what Dr. Hoekma said in that original quote I had for you from him. He said, if we assume that the book of Revelation is to be interpreted exclusively futuristically, and we found that it's not exclusive, but a large section of it is, so that assumption is questionable. And let us assume further that what is presented in Revelation 20 must necessarily follow in chronological order what was described in chapter 19. And again, we see through those 3 evidences that there is evidence in the book itself that there is a chronological sequence to what's happening and what's being unfolded in the book, both the Greek, the outline in verse 19, as well as the progression that we see in the judgments that are described in the book. Then he says, we are virtually compelled to believe that 1,000-year reign depicted in chapter 20, verse 4, must come after the return of Christ, described in chapter 19, verse 11. What's he saying here? Well, what's he saying by that last phrase is that the return of Christ in chapter 19, verse 11, is before his 1,000-year reign. I think we've shown that there's a chronological progression here. So it definitely calls into question the assumptions that the amillennialists dismiss. So, if we have shown adequately that there is a futuristic component and there is a chronological presentation, then the amillennialist is really compelled to believe in premillennialism. Let me dwell on this just a moment. I don't want to belabor the point here, but assumptions are important. We could call them presuppositions. And when we bring assumptions to bear in our study of the Bible, there's a tendency to want to make the data of the Bible, that is our interpretation of that data, fit our assumption. We could call these presuppositions. Another words for this, or a logical fallacy associated with this, is known as confirmation bias. That is, you interpret things, interpret the evidence that's presented to you from a particular point of view to confirm what you already believe. So I think that's what we see here, at any rate, as we look at, just begins to start looking at amillennialism, is that they are bringing a theological grid to the Bible itself and interpreting what's in the Bible according to that grid or those assumptions they are either bringing with them or, for the amillennialist, they dismiss. So I want to point out that for the premillennialist, we try to take the Bible literally, just as it's written. We pay attention to grammar, how the words are used and how they're structured. And we also pay attention to the historical context. So we see that here as well. Sorry about that. Don't know why my camera moves sometimes, but it does. So we're taking a literal, historical, grammatical approach, not a presuppositional approach. And that's an important difference with what we're doing here. So we've addressed the assumptions, the presuppositions that the amillennialist makes as they come to interpret chapter 20. Not just verse 4, but verses 1 through 6. So the next time that we look at amillennialism, we are going to examine their interpretation of Revelation 20, verse 6. So there we are. Love to hear your comments. You can comment just below in the comments section for this video, or you can feel free to send me an email at drdan@theofaith.org. Dr. Dan at theofaith.org. Like to hear your comments about this or your observations. Hopefully this is helpful to you. God bless you guys. And may the Lord bless you as you dig into His Word and bring that literal, historical, grammatical approach to understanding His Word. May He use that to enlighten you and give you just greater joy in what the future holds for the church.